Hi, welcome. This is an introduction to critical thinking called Think for Yourself. My name is Mark Thorsby, and in this video series, we're following along with a workbook for arguments by David Morrow and Anthony Weston. And I encourage you to follow along as well. You can take a look. Here's what the book looks like. So I hope you'll be able to join us. You've probably been watching the video series, and we've been looking at the different rules for reasoning. Really just sort of an introduction guide of principles you should use when both evaluating the reasons that other people give for arguments, as well as the reasons that you make for arguments. Today what we're going to be taking a look at is what's known as Chapter 7 in the book, extended arguments. So we're going to be taking a look at really three different rules of reasoning that are related to extended arguments in this video. And you'll see that although throughout the entire course of lectures here, I've been talking about the idea that on the one hand, we can use these rules of reasoning to analyze arguments. We can also use the rules of reasoning here in order to create or write our own arguments. You'll see that Chapter 7 in our discussion today on extended arguments is fundamentally related to the latter. That is, we're going to be really emphasizing the role that these reasons take when we ourselves create arguments. So I want you, as you're thinking of this video, to think of yourself as an argument creator, as someone who cultivates and creates arguments in order to take positions and convince other people to hold these positions. Now, we're going to start off with a question here, which is, what exactly is an extended argument? Now, up until this point, we've primarily been taking a look at what we might call as short arguments. Now, a short argument is very simple, and I'm not going to try to give some sort of precise definition, but we could say that a short argument is essentially any argument that has a single conclusion and has clear premises related to that single conclusion. So, for instance, if I say all men are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? That argument has a single conclusion, namely that Socrates is mortal, but has two premises that support it. Remember here, this goes back all the way to our first rule of reasoning here, is to recognize the difference between premises and conclusions. A conclusion is the claim that's being made or the claim that's being put forth, and the premise is the evidence or the reasons that are given in support of that claim. So for instance, if someone argues someone argues marijuana should be legalized for recreational use, that would be a type of conclusion. And then perhaps premises related to it could be the idea that, for instance, all people have a right to recreational activities that don't harm other people, and so on and so forth. So mainly we've been looking at short arguments. You'll see that extended arguments really have a sort of very similar function, except the difference here is that an extended argument you can drill down into. So an extended argument is, or what we might call a long form argument, the type of argument you read in a long essay, is actually a series of multiple arguments that have been combined together. Similar to sort of kind of the way you might build something, right? An extended argument is such that where you have multiple arguments that hang upon each other. So for instance, if you're reading a long argument, let's say you read a 10,000 word essay or something, right? There's going to be usually a single conclusion that at the end of the day, that's what the article is about. And that conclusion is supported by multiple premises, usually more than just one or two, usually upwards on the order of between 4 to 6 premises. Now, an extended argument is one in which each one of these premises is then further backed up as an argument by even more premises and conclusions. And then the premises of the sub-arguments are backed up as arguments that have their own premises and conclusions. So you can see here is that really what an extended argument is that you take one argument, and then the premises for that argument, you give secondary arguments for those premises. And then for the premises of those arguments, you give even more arguments, or I guess third tier or third level arguments. So an extended argument is just a combination of arguments that are put together, sort of organized together. And this would make sense because if you're reading an extended argument, someone's going to make a claim. Maybe the claim is that marijuana should be legalized for recreational use. Well, in order to justify that, there's going to be reasons given, but those reasons themselves need to be justified into other arguments. So an extended argument is just multiple arguments that have been put together. In logic, we sometimes call this an enthymeme. An enthymeme really usually refers to the idea of an argument that's missing a premise or conclusion, but usually, I'm sorry, not an enthymeme, I misspoke, a sorites. In logic, we call this a sorites when you have multiple arguments combined where the conclusion of one argument functions as the premise for another argument, and then the conclusion of that argument functions as the premise for another argument, and so on and so forth, until eventually you reach the primary conclusion of the argument, which is usually what we call the thesis statement. So that's a little bit about what an extended argument is. When your book refers to this, the authors, Morrow and Weston, they say, for instance, an extended argument is when you go beyond a short argument. It's a more detailed line of thought. And I think more importantly, we might say they describe an extended argument as one in which the main ideas are clearly laid out and their own premises in turn are also spelled out and defined, right? If you have any practice in writing essays and you've taken like a beginning English or composition class, you know that the extended arguments is really just code for the types of arguments you're typically asked to write for a class, or in any sort of persuasive setting. Okay, I mean this would apply obviously for the law and so on and so forth. So that's what an extended argument is. It's really a combination of multiple arguments that have been conjunctively combined together to really make a strong case, right? Now, what we're going to do now is let's take a look at 3 rules of reasoning that can help us out. The first is Rule 29, which is explore the issue. Now, here we're primarily talking about before you write your own extended argument, it's important that you explore the issue. And what does this mean? Well, on the one hand, it means that you have to begin with an issue, not with a position. So for instance, if I start off with the issue, I'll just stick with the example of recreational marijuana usage. That's an issue, but whether I'm for it or against it is a position about the issue. When you're just beginning and you're trying to explore an issue, you don't want to start off by thinking you already know the answer to the issue. So you don't start with your position. You start in general with just understanding and clarifying what's at stake in the issue itself. So this means, for instance, that if I'm going to explore the issue of recreational marijuana usage, then that means, for instance, I have to maybe understand the issue of what marijuana usage entails and the differences and the types of marijuana usage. But I also want to uncover and define, for instance, what the issue of recreational usage means. And so you want to explore the issue. The goal, at least at this stage, when you're just exploring, is to arrive at a well-informed position. So ultimately, you want to find that position. But before you can get to the well-informed position, you need to consider all of the other positions possibly. And ultimately, once you arrive at a well-informed position, your goal is to then defend that position with a valid and a sound argument, if it's possible to give a sound argument. Keep in mind quickly, a valid argument, and we've mentioned this again and again in the series, but a valid argument is an argument in which it is impossible for the premises to be false if the conclusion, rephrase that. A valid argument is one in which it is impossible to have a false conclusion if you have true premises. A sound argument is an argument that really does have true premises. In some cases, for instance, you can make a valid argument but not know if it's really sound. That is, you don't really know if your premises are sound. Consider, for instance, theoretical physics. In theoretical physics, the mathematician or the physicist here will come up with an argument, for instance, that explains some sort of natural observable phenomena, maybe a black hole or something like this. And using mathematics, they can create a valid argument. But whether or not that argument is really true in the world requires more than just theoretical physics. You have to go to practical physics, and you have to actually run experiments and things like this. Our goal ultimately is to figure out which positions is to create a valid argument, but hopefully, if possible, a sound argument. In some cases, we just lack the requisite knowledge to know whether or not the premises of an argument really are true. Validity concerns the inference of the two. For more information about this, take not only a look at some of our first videos in the series, but take a look at the last video I posted on the different forms of deductive arguments, all of which are valid. Okay, so That's what the goal is as you're exploring the issue. Now, some of the things that, and some of this is from your book, and some of it I just sort of threw in there because I think that's helpful. Now, as you explore an issue, I think some of the things is that number one, you should be skeptical. And what do I mean by skeptical? It means that you shouldn't necessarily think that the ideas an author is arguing, for instance, are correct. Be skeptical. Be willing, um, or consider the fact that it might be their position or an argument you're considering or a position you're considering might just simply be wrong, ill-advised, or ill-informed, even if the position is one you agree with, right? So, for instance, if you agree with the recreational usage of marijuana, well, you should start off by being skeptical about that position. Maybe it's a bad idea, and you have to, as you explore, consider these different possibilities. Now, just saying that we should be skeptical kind of isn't fair because it's very difficult for us as human beings to disassociate ourselves from our already previously held beliefs. So one of the ways in which that you can be more skeptical, or one of the ways you can explore an issue, is number two, to learn to ask questions. Start asking questions. So if you're reading a position, you're exploring it, start asking questions. There's different types of questions. You can ask questions about clarification, right? You can ask questions about the structural relationship between the claims that are made. You can also ask questions about the factual nature of claims being put forth. So there's a whole range of questions, and the key to being a good critical thinker, I think, in many respects, boils down to the capacity and ability to ask questions. So get into the habit of asking questions. Not necessarily trying to create questions that stump people, but real questions, right? Recognize first and foremost that you don't know everything. And I, of course, can admit this, I don't know everything. And so asking questions is quite important. The other thing, number three, is consider diverse explanations. In some cases, when we're talking about, for instance, an issue or position, there may be an explanation given. For instance, when we're doing research, we may discover an explanation for something, but we have to consider the possibility that there might be other explanations possible. So as you explore, recognize that there might be a diversity of explanations. So, because what you want to avoid is, you want to avoid finding a position that you already agree with, and then finding an explanation that you already agree with, and then just sticking to that and ignoring all the other possibilities. That's not very clear, and it's not very critical. And so that's something you want to consider as diverse explanations. The other thing is you need to begin to practice weighing arguments in their reasons. Some arguments are more have more weight um, in a broader thesis than other arguments, right? So that is, for instance, some arguments may be absolutely necessary, whereas other arguments maybe just help and further articulate a position rather than being absolutely fundamental to it. So you have to begin to learn how to assess the relative importance of an argument for a given position, thesis, or subject. So number four is weigh arguments and their reasons. Number five is we have to always remember that thinking is an open-ended process, right? So there's a certain degree here of which we have to be open to possibilities. So there's this notion here of thinking as an open-ended process. Thinking, we should consider these things as something that we can continually be working on and engaging with. Notice here that in order to explore something, you really have to be willing to see things in a different way. And this requires the open-ended process of thinking. Number six, avoid cliche arguments. One of the things that you want to avoid is that you want to avoid arguments that you're typically used to hearing. Simply because they don't usually provide very much importance to the position you're looking at. And usually when we use cliche arguments, and cliche means an argument, strategy, or a justification for something that is frequently given but never really thought through. So for instance, I frequently see this when I teach my ethics class and we talk about abortion. The two cliche arguments against abortion tend to be the argument from the right to life and the argument from personhood. Now, both of these are important arguments, and I'm not denying that. And I don't think that every version of them is cliche, But what I do think is that a lot of times when we're researching and exploring an issue, when we find something that sounds familiar to us, we have a tendency to just stop right there. We stop being skeptical, we stop asking questions, and what we seem to start doing is we just start repeating those same arguments rather than thinking them through more thoroughly. So as you explore an issue, you want to avoid this temptation for simplistic explanations and cliche arguments. Okay. Number 7 here would be also don't prejudge the conclusion. So don't start off exploring an issue already having decided what the final conclusion should be, because that's not very open-ended, that's not very critical, and it means that what you're naturally going to do if you already prejudge a conclusion is you're going to create a blind spot in which you're not going to consider things that you should consider, especially counterfactual evidence or counterexamples. So I think that's why it's important to be skeptical. And I think you have to have really a sort of philosophical spirit where you recognize that you can be wrong and you're ultimately interested in finding out what's really the case, with the supposition that you might in fact be wrong. So one of the things you can do to practice exploring these issues is whenever someone asks a question or an issue is raised, think of 3 important questions that need to be answered in order to take a position. So here's sort of an example. Imagine if someone says, should marijuana be legalized? And here I mean recreationally. So should marijuana be recreationally legalized? So if you want, pause the video here and just ask yourself, think to yourself, what are 3 important questions that have bearing on the answer to the legalization of marijuana? So I think some important questions here, I'll just do this. I haven't thought through some big answer here, but I think one important question would be, for instance, what sort of harm does marijuana cause as an illicit substance? So for instance, some substances cause harm, greater harm than others. The more harm there is, the less likelihood it should be legalized. The less harm it is, the greater the case for legalization recreationally. That's one question I would ask, is just the harm about marijuana usage. Number 2, another important question here would be, what is the scope of legalization? For instance, what does it mean to legalize something in the first place? And are there different degrees of legalization? And how would recreational legalization differ, for instance, from medical legalization? Or also, what's the difference between legalization and decriminalization? There's a whole bunch of range of issues. So on the one hand, I want to know what the harm of marijuana usage is. On the other hand, I want to know exactly what we mean by legalization. A third possibility here would be, an important question would be, what is the social effect, economic or otherwise, that the recreational legalization of marijuana might concur, or not concur, but create? So that's another important question. So get in the habit of asking 3 important questions. It's really simple. So as you go through your daily life and you hear people think about these different subjects, for instance, the news, recently, for instance, with the think about in politics, lots of issues are raised, for instance, about immigration. Ask yourself, what are 3 important questions that we really need to answer before we can take a position? So get into the habit of asking questions before you come to your conclusion or position. Okay, let's take a look here now at the next rule of reasoning that applies. And this is Rule 30. Begin to spell out the basic ideas as arguments. Okay, so one of the things here is what we're talking about is building and constructing our own extended arguments. So that means that when you have an idea, you have to get into you have to get into the mindset of and into the practice of being able to take an idea and translate that idea into an argument. Or as I have it here, you want to take your position and then reframe it as an argument, right? Now, when we're talking about constructing arguments, we have to emphasize here is that specific conclusions need to be backed up with reasons or evidence. So anytime there's specificity, you need another argument to help make to, I guess, ground or legitimize a specific conclusion. So imagine, let's just stick with our example of recreational usage of marijuana, since that was our earlier example. Imagine that I take a position. So imagine my position is that no, marijuana should not be recreationally legalized, right? Okay, so there's my position. Now, how can I reframe that position as an argument? Remember, an argument has premises and a conclusion. So let me see if I can do this. Usually my position is going to function as my conclusion. So my conclusion in this case is that marijuana should not be recreational legalized, right? Legalized recreationally. So what would be some premises that would help, or reasons that would help justify that position? For instance, maybe I'll just make something up here, right? Imagine if I say, because marijuana usage, um, because marijuana usage entails neurological harm, it should not be legalized, right? So there you go. I've rephrased it as a simple argument, right? Now you can see, now I have a premise that I can then further develop as another argument, right? So, right, because I said marijuana, and here we could debate about it. We're not going to worry about whether or not these premises are true, but if I said marijuana usage um, causes neurological harm to individuals. Individuals should not be harmed by things which are legal. Therefore, the recreational usage of marijuana should not occur, right? In this case, now since I have two premises, I can now take those premises and see if I can come up with arguments to support those premises and continue so on and so forth until I develop this extended argument. So get used to taking an idea and turning it into an argument. So one of the ways you can practice this is, I think, with pen and paper. This is what your book recommends, and I do too. Pull out a pen and a piece of paper or a pencil and begin to draft your ideas as premises and conclusions. And you want to do this in pen and paper because sometimes you don't know what the arguments are going to be, and it can take a while, and you may have to rephrase them multiple times, right? Some of the advice here is that when you start doing this, start by aiming at a relatively short argument to start with, right? So don't start off with a very complex argument. Start with something simple, right? Something that has no more than 3 or 4 premises, right? And a single conclusion. And then one of the things that's really helpful is taking a look at the last chapter, the last video on deductive argumentation. You can also practice using these deductive argument forms. Recall that one of the argument forms we looked at was the idea that if A, then B, A, conclusion, therefore B, right? This is the modus ponens argument. So one of the things you can do is, as you begin to construct and to draft these ideas into arguments, put them into a deductive format. This will ensure that your arguments are logical, and it will ensure that all of your arguments relate. It'll make the best possible argument, and it'll also ensure that your argument as a whole is valid, at least logically. Now, it doesn't mean your argument's true, because sometimes just because it's logical, it doesn't mean it's actually true. Okay, and some things, though we hope to think that things which are true are logical, right? But it's not always the reverse. So once you begin to practice using these deductive argument forms, then what you're going to do is you want to go and work on revising your first attempt with better attempts. So this is sort of a draft procedure where you have an idea, you're going to reframe it to an argument, and then sort of work through the different arguments, then take pause, come back and see if you can make it better. And sort of through the iterations and variations, as you take your time, and this is really important, you want to take your time, then what you'll find out is you'll slowly develop a really robust, strong argument. Now, for most people watching this video who are not practicing philosophers, nor probably do you plan on being a philosopher or anything like this is very important for when you write papers or you're presenting ideas if you're constructing a PowerPoint presentation or something like this, right? You want to refine your argument so that way it's very clear what you're arguing and how, right? So you can also practice by take a position and construct an argument for and against something else. Like take a position, then construct arguments that are both for your position and against your position, right? So you can take these two things. So here's an example. Imagine if someone makes the claim athletes should not use performance-enhancing drugs, right? Okay, first off, let's think of an argument that would support this claim, right? So maybe we could say is that, so for instance, and by the way, one of the other things that's a key trick is usually if this is the conclusion, then the terms that are in it should be in the premises too, right? So you can say something like this, is that um, athletes should not use performance enhancing drugs because performance enhancing drugs do not allow for fair competition, right? And athletics requires fair competition. Okay, so that's an argument for the claim. Now let's see if we can construct an argument against the claim, against the idea that athletes should not use performance enhancing drugs. Maybe we can make an argument that sounds like this. It's false that athletes should not use performance enhancing drugs because athletes are constantly doing things to their body in order to enhance their performance, whether that be through their diet or through the types of exercises they use in their regular routine and in their practice, right? As such, athletics is not something that's against performance enhancement activity. Using drugs in order to enhance performance should not be, is not wrong, because it's merely just one type of enhancement that athletes can use. They're already using other types of enhancement, right? So that's maybe not as good of an argument, I don't think, but it is a type of argument that would go against the thesis. So getting used to practicing asking questions, but also taking positions for and against arguments. That's really quite helpful. Okay, third rule of reasoning here for today. This is rule 31. You want to defend premises with arguments of their own. And I've already been saying this throughout, right? But every time you have a premise, now you're going to develop further arguments for those premises. So you want to defend and develop your ideas accordingly. Now I wanted to sort of give you a quick example. I pulled this from the internet. It's not my example, but this is an example of an extended argument in which you can sort of see here, in our chapter here, our book actually has a section in the appendix on extended arguments, so you can take a look at them. That is on how to diagram these. But you can see here what's at the bottom is the final conclusion, and what's at the top are the premises. The arrows represent inferential support. Okay, so number 4 here is the primary argument. Now, the primary thesis here is that a substance X ought to be banned. So some substance ought to be banned. Maybe this substance is some sort of performance enhancing substance, or maybe it's drugs or something like this. Something needs to be banned. But why? You can see here is that the combination of premises 1, 2, and 3 seem to support that, right? Someone could say an athlete's use of substance X causes harm to society. Society needs to be protected from this harm. Banning substance X will protect society. Therefore, number 4, the substance ought to be banned. So you can see here, this part right here is our primary argument. This is our conclusion, and these are our premises. Now, when we talk here about the idea of developing your argument, we're talking about developing arguments for these ones here. Not for number 4, but for numbers 1 through 3. And that's precisely what's being done here. So for instance, hold on a moment. Someone's calling me. We'll just ignore it. It's my wife. And I need to finish this video, so we'll just ignore it. Okay, so you can see here is that premise 1 in this example gets supported by further arguments between, this is a further argument for premise 1. You can see 5 and 6. 5 states that the use of substance X provides role models for who encourage an attitude of disrespect towards rules and authority. And number 6 here is that the use of substance X provides role models who encourage other forms of substance abuse. So we have a role model argument that's supposed to defend the idea that an athlete's use of a substance can cause harm. Now, why should we accept those reasons? Well, number 5 here is justified by by premises 7, 8, and 11. I'm not going to read through all these. I'll let you go ahead and read through this if you want. But this is a sort of good example of the way in which you might build out an extended argument. Okay? So let's see here if there's anything else. Yeah, so I think that's an easy way to see the example. Now, what we can say here is that each premise therefore becomes the conclusion of a further argument that you're going to have to work out. And this isn't from your book, but here's how I sort of put it when I think about how I would want to explain this to my students. So imagine if you're writing a paper. If you're writing a paper, we always say you need to have some sort of thesis. The thesis is the primary claim. And what we can say is that the thesis really represents the conclusion of your ultimate argument. Now, your ultimate argument needs evidence, and this is what we call the premises. Now, each premise needs its own supporting argument, and then those premises need their supporting arguments, etc. Now, what this means is that a good argument ultimately depends upon a constituted whole. That is, a really good argument is one in which everything is operating together in synchronicity, such that if you disagree with any of the premises, you end up in a real big pickle, right? So it forces your reader to really agree or to really seriously consider your conclusion. And so this is why strong arguments have this nature of being extended. The other thing here is I want to mention here is that concrete examples help. So a lot of times, now we have to be clear here that there's a difference between arguments and explanations, right? An argument is meant to prove a thesis, to prove a claim, or at least to provide the evidence for a claim, whereas an explanation is meant to clarify a claim so that you understand what the claim is in the first place. Now, it's kind of confusing because in the same way that an argument has a premise and a conclusion, explanations also have an explanans and an explanandum. That is, an explanation has both that which needs the explaining and that which does the explaining, right? So a lot of times arguments and explanations look very similar. But although we've been talking about extended arguments, a lot of times it is very essential for you to include explanations, because sometimes people you may have an argument, but people just don't understand exactly what your premises are without further explanation. So what I would say is that what you'll typically see if you're going to go through an argument, let's go back to this example here. Right? So if you go to this example, this is a big, long, extended argument, but you can see any one of these premises could be further explained with an explanation. So a lot of times you want to create an extended argument with multiple premises, but then you'll want to include explanations for at least those premises which are unclear or more difficult, you think, for your reader to understand. So for instance, imagine, let's take reason number 8. The reason there is the use of substance X can only encourage an attitude of disrespect towards rule and authority if the use of the substance X is banned in the first place. So there, for instance, maybe it would be helpful to your reader to give an example, right, of how you might actually apply this sort of formal argument to the specific case. So concrete examples can really help here to make your argument even that much more persuasive. Because remember, you can have a really logical argument, but if no one understands you, it doesn't matter. So you need to be able to explain things as well as to argue them. Okay, so how can you practice this? Well, one of the ways you can do this is you can practice by identifying premises that need further support. So practice by supplying a supplementary argument for a premise that may be more shaky than the rest. So, actually, let me give you this example. So imagine, and this comes from the text, so I'm sort of stealing from the text here, from the homework. Imagine someone makes the argument, most Americans support capital punishment. Politicians are unlikely to ban a practice that most of their constituents support. Therefore, American politicians are unlikely to ban capital punishment. Okay, so you can see here, take a look at this argument. It's a simple argument. We have one conclusion. American politicians are unlikely to support a ban in capital punishment. And it's supported with two premises, right? On the one hand, the idea that most Americans support capital punishment. And the second premise here is that politicians are unlikely to ban things that their constituents support, right? Now, you can imagine here, okay, let's identify what argument needs more support. Well, for instance, both premises could use additional support, I think. I think the one that needs the most support probably is, well, let's put it this way. The first premise here could use additional support in the sense that the claim is that most Americans support capital punishment. I think that the kind of support that's needed there would be, well, is that really true? Is there, for instance, statistical evidence or political polling that demonstrates that this is the case? Or, for instance, do most states have capital punishment? If not, that would also seem to support this argument or this claim. Take a look at the second one. Politicians are unlikely to ban a practice that most of their constituents support. Well, we were just talking about recreational marijuana, right? Most politicians are against the legalization of recreational marijuana, right? Yet probably many of their constituents support it. So I think this second premise demands that we need further argument. So let's imagine here, what would be an argument that could support not the final conclusion, but just this claim here: politicians are unlikely to ban a practice that most of their constituents support. Well, I think here's what we would make, is that the idea is that politicians are dependent upon their constituents' votes for their job, number one, right? Constituents tend to vote for things they support. Politicians who do not support the things that constituents do are less likely to be reelected. Therefore, politicians are unlikely to ban a practice that most of their constituents support. So so you can see here, I've just really quickly and sort of loose and dirty practiced by supplying a supplementary argument for a premise that maybe demands a little bit more attention. Okay, so that's an example of the way in which you can take a look at these arguments. Okay, this is what we're going to conclude there for today. Thank you very much for watching. Let me just go like this. We've been looking at these two. In the next video, we're going to take a look at a couple more reasons. We're going to talk a little bit more about extended arguments. But that concludes our video today. I hope this has been helpful. And remember, really go ahead and take the time to practice these things. And if you're following along in the book, if you're in my class, then for instance, the exercises in this book were very, very helpful in terms of forcing you and giving you the opportunity to really practice these things. Okay? Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate your attention, and I look forward to seeing you guys online.